Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be talking about today surrounds a very disturbed man called David Fuller. This case was in the news a couple of years ago, 2020, when he was finally caught basically for what, well, I say for what he'd done. They had no idea the extent of what he actually did, the disturbing extent of what he actually did. Boy, is it just that. It actually made me like sick to my core what he did. So yeah, you will find out if you don't already know the story. He is British. It was suggested by Brittany, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have, and of course if you have any more, please do let me know. David Fuller was born on the 4th of September in 1954. He grew up in Portsmouth and as a schoolboy was often in trouble. He would steal bikes and things like that a lot. He would also get in trouble for damaging properties, setting fires, you know, just general mischievous things. When he left school, he went on and trained to become an electrician and along with a maintenance man, and he would work in shipyards in Portsmouth during the 70s. So during that time, he started doing things called what the police actually dubbed as creeper burglaries. It was something along the lines of looking in on people and taking little bits of things, just generally being, yeah, a creep. He actually got like done for 26 of them, but then he didn't spend any time in prison or anything like that. And then he began working at a hospital as like a handyman, electrician, maintenance man, you know what I mean. And he worked there for like 30 years. He was a very well liked man. People said that he was very quiet, kept himself to himself, polite, just generally nice guy. The thing with him is that he also had access to every part of the hospital with his like key card. Having previously experienced that, normally you get access to the areas that you are sort of required to be in, but he was maintenance and so they maybe needed him here, there, everywhere to fix whatever. So that's why he had access to like all areas. Now let us jump to 1987, and this is when David actually committed his first murder. Wendy Nell was his first victim. She'd had a quiet night. She was in work and then, you know, her boyfriend picked her up from work at this photo development place that she worked at. She, you know, they met, he dropped her off home. She was doing some errands, things like that, and then he left and went wherever he went. And Wendy was 25 years old at this point. She'd recently separated from her husband and was just, I don't know, she had this boyfriend, she was just testing out all these new waters and just living life. She was due to go in work like, it must have been the next day, right? I think it must have been the next day. And, you know, she didn't, so people got worried. They ended up like contacting all these people. Her boyfriend essentially ended up going back around to her house to see whether she was okay. Like, why had she not turned up in work? It was strange, okay? So he goes around there and he actually finds her deceased in the bed. The window was open at the back. This is where the perpetrator had got in, where David got in. Obviously they didn't know that at the time. Basically, from what I have found, that window was left open because it had been painted over, so they couldn't latch it, and she was in a bed sit. That's where she lived, and that's important because that's what actually these two murders would be called, the Bedside Murders. So yeah, because it was painted over, she couldn't actually close it to latch it fully, and basically he got in through that window and he murdered her. The police came in, they did all the policing, you know how it goes, but sadly they didn't get anywhere. And at the time, this was like the 80s, so if they had DNA and things, they couldn't test it. They didn't have the means for that, so they just did their examinations, they did their investigations, and they got nowhere from it. And her case went cold. 5 months later, he struck again. 20-year-old waitress Caroline Pierce. She was last seen getting out of a cab in the front of her bedsit that she rented. And then neighbours did report hearing a scream later on, but I guess they looked and they didn't see anything. They didn't really inquire too much into it. She'd been out drinking with friends and neighbours that night. They hear the scream and she's just not there. She's just vanished, I guess. They couldn't find her for a while until a dog walker came across her body. It was 3 weeks later, you know, she was found naked, had been violated, which also Wendy had been violated too, I didn't mention, and had been strangled. So the circumstances were very similar between the two, you know, and the police were starting to think that maybe they had like a serial killer on their hands because they were pretty identical. Now, Carolyn had actually recently confided in her boyfriend that she felt like she was being watched, stalked, followed, and she was that worried about it that she would make sure that all her windows and doors were locked. And the police actually figured that she had been murdered in the graveyard, sort of behind her house. And sadly, again, they looked into it, they found nothing. The DNA and things they weren't able to do anything with that. So they took their samples, they preserved it all. Their investigation went nowhere, and her case also went cold. And these cases would stay cold for 33 years when DNA technology finally caught up with them. So this is when they finally started looking into like historic cases, and the one of Wendy and Carolyn was the case that they were looking into. They managed to DNA profile it, they put it in the database, and it actually came up with quite a lot of suspects initially. Then they got 90 probable suspects. They each began narrowing them down until they ended up with just one. This relative was a man named Freddie Fuller. And you may be thinking, like, we're talking about David Fuller, not Freddie Fuller. But he was 86 years old at this point, Freddie Fuller. And he was a relative of David. I'm not entirely sure how. I can't remember. I've forgotten that piece of information. My apologies. But they asked him all these questions, like, was he in the Tunbridge area when the woman was killed, you know, things like that. And he said that he had, it was a cousin. He was his cousin. He said that he had a cousin that actually worked in that area at the time. And in fact, he still worked at the local hospital there, and his name was none other than David Fuller. So what they do is they gather everything they have and they go straight to David Fuller's house and they confront him. He doesn't even deny it. There's a video of the police going in and like telling him what they're basically arresting him on the suspicion of the two women's murders from all those years back. It just doesn't really react too much. I guess he probably lived his life with the thought that maybe he would get caught one day. So you've got this David Fuller, right, down for the murder of these two women. You know, finally, amazing. Wendy's mother, sadly Wendy's dad had passed away, I believe, and you know, all they wanted was to find out who killed their little girl, well, daughter, not so little, but they're always your little girl, aren't they, your children? Yeah, okay. Anyway, he had sadly passed away, but her mother was still alive, so she was so thankful to finally find out who had done this to her daughter. But nobody ever thought the truth. Nobody ever could comprehend the true extent of his crimes, because as the police are searching his home, like they always do, they start finding some, let's just say some like discs and memory units taped to the back of his drawers. So obviously hiding them, you know, in place. And at this point, David was married, I believe. He had 2 children, you know, he had lived a life and people thought a normal life, you know, he was a nice man. They spoke to like ex-girlfriends of his who said that he was never aggressive, never this, never that. He was just a normal, nice guy. Yeah. They find these memory SD cards, things like that, and when they look into that is when the whole horrific truth of what he actually did comes out. There were over 14 million images of him performing acts on basically deceased bodies. Yeah, you heard that right. And his known victims would range from like 9 years old to 100 years old. And he would do all sorts with them. I am seriously not going to get into the details of it because it is so disgusting and just so vile that these poor people who had lost their lives through one way or another, and then they are going to the morgue and in this hospital that this maintenance man works in, and he is going in there and doing vile, disgraceful things to them, and they can't, like, where is the respect for the dead though? It's just absolutely horrific. And one case in particular, which actually really broke my heart, was a 24-year-old law graduate called Azra Kamal. Now, her story, how she actually ended up, she was one of David's victims, after death victims. And it's so sad what happened to her. She basically, her car set on fire, I believe, while she was driving. And I think that the car, like, exploded. Like, she was having engine difficulties, pulled over on the hard shoulder, and the car, like, exploded. So they were out of the way. They were, you know, out of danger, which was brilliant. Thank goodness. She didn't actually pass away in that car. How she actually passed away was like a freak accident where she jumped over, like, a railing or a barrier, thinking that it would be a central reservation and there would be more road on the other side. Bearing in mind it was dark. But instead, it was not a centre divide. It was, in fact, a 35-foot drop. So she jumps over this barrier without sadly checking that there was solid ground on the other side. It had no idea that there wasn't, and literally fell to her death, which is so devastating. Paramedics attended. There was just nothing they could do. She was pronounced deceased at the scene. And then, obviously, her body was taken to the same hospital that David worked in. And obviously, when her mum was informed, she was absolutely heartbroken, like you would be. She ends up spending some time with her daughter in the morgue. Little did she know that David had already spent some time with her daughter, which is just disgusting. And she talks about it. It actually made me, like, tear up because she did an interview with Sky about it. And it's just so sad. Like, she was kissing her daughter and spending time with her, and that monster had already, like, abused her. And then he went back 3 times as well. So he did it, like, before and after she left, which is just awful. I believe that they have actually named and identified, like, 78 of his victims, something like that. Correct me if that information is now incorrect, but I don't think it is. Unless they've named more, like, after that. But he did keep names and things, date of births, date of deaths. He kept information on them, and then he took all his photos and stuff. Gross. And then David, like, he said that he didn't do anything, you know, he was innocent, blah blah blah. I mean, they had all that evidence. They literally had him there. And when they were looking into it, he was part of this bike riding club, I believe. In the 80s this was, when it came to Wendy and Carolyn, and he drove past the area quite frequently where Carolyn's body was found. So, you know, there was ties in that way. And he eventually did admit his guilt on all fronts, but he said that he didn't want to go into details on it, which just, I mean, we don't want to know the details, but what, you feel ashamed now that people are questioning you and you've been caught? You feel ashamed about it, you don't want to go into the details. Well, screw you. Nobody wants to hear the details, but sadly, you know, that's what you did. And why? Just why? Why did you do that? And then they looked into it more, and basically, like I said, he had it all figured out. He would kind of groom, in a sense, the staff around him. So the mortuary, like where they did the post-mortems, I think the mortuary trays, I don't really know what they're called. I don't want to be disrespectful here because I'm very much a believer of respect the dead myself. You know, when they put them on the trolleys that go inside, like, the fridge to keep their bodies, whatever. Yeah, that, I think it went, when they put it in, it also went out into the mortuary side as well. And the mortuary didn't have cameras at the time, so David was allowed to go in and out because he had access to everywhere. And nobody really questioned him. He knew that the staff finished at like 4 on the mortuary. And so he would be in the other side doing what the disgusting things that he was doing, whatever. whilst people were actually bringing in bodies on the other side, and like I said, the staff never asked questions. They just thought he was this really nice guy. He would buy pizza, order wine, just to do what he did all night long. Yeah, just absolutely disgraceful things, which you just don't even want to know the details of, especially since one of his youngest victims was 9. And I can't even imagine. It's just defilement and just at its worst. Also, I didn't mention as well, he was actually 67 when he was caught. So, you know, it's just so frustrating that he actually lived his life after doing all of them despicable things and killing 2 women in the 80s. And it's just really sad that obviously, I mean, it's not through anyone's fault, but technology wasn't up to date then. They couldn't sequence the DNA. They couldn't track it all like they can now. And it allowed him to get away with it for so long and then carry out these other atrocities that he did. David Fuller was handed 2 life sentences to run concurrently with a 12-year term for his other crimes. Now, let me just put in here, which I found absolutely disgraceful. Apparently, with crimes such as what he did, like with deceased bodies, I know there's a word for it, I don't really want to say it on here because I'll probably get flagged. But what he actually did carries a sentence of like 2 years, which is just shameful because I'm sorry. It is basically a form of like sexual assault in my eyes. I know the person is no longer alive, but I don't know. And I know it's a bit iffy and a grey area. In my eyes, at least, it still is. And they should have way harsher sentences for that. And I believe that Azra's mother is fighting for that because I totally agree with her on that front. You know, what this monster did to her daughter after she had been in a tragic accident and lost her life is just disgraceful, and he should have got more time. Anyone that does that should get more time for it. They shouldn't just get a couple of years. I just think that's really wrong. But that's just my opinion. David Fuller will essentially die in prison. You know, he'll never get to see the light of day ever again. He will never get to, I don't know, satisfy those disgusting urges again. And can you imagine his family finding out? Like his wife and his children. That must be so horrific as well, to find out that your father has done those things and was probably still doing those things. It's awful. My heart goes out to everyone involved in this case, which is a lot of people and potentially even more. You know, if he did it to people that he'd... I mean, I'm pretty sure he documented most of them, but what if he didn't? What if he didn't document some of them? You know, there could have been more victims out there that we don't even know about, which is just heartbreaking. And you've got to think about the families of those left behind, like Azra's mother, that mother of that 9-year-old little girl who was just so heartbroken when she found out what had happened to her baby by just a monster. It's just, honestly, you can jump into like a massive rabbit hole of it all. I wish I could put all of the victims' names in and things. There's just so many of them out there. Obviously, Azra is like a one that's really focused on, and her name's been put out there. Her mother said a lot about it, things like that. There's lots of interviews, so that's why I put her name in, but I wish I could put them all in. Sadly, that's just not possible at this moment in time. But yeah, my heart really does go out to everyone involved. This man is just such a monster, and you just, honestly, you can't believe the things that he did. I was very shocked by the things that he did. So yeah, well, that is the end of this case. If you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway, that's all I have today on the bedsit killer and the monster that is David Fuller. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.